Welcome, everybody. And especially I want to thank our panelists today. So Bethany Coburn, an assistant professor at the College of Business at Northern Illinois University. Gabriel Sala, who's a postdoctoral associate at the DeMoore McKim School of Business at Northeastern University. And Linus Dallander, who's a professor at ESMT Berlin. So thank you all so much for being panelists on today's presentation. So I'll be moderating the conversation. So essentially, we'll just go in the order that we have it set up on the schedule. So we'll start with Bethany, followed by Gabriel, and then finally Linus. Bethany's going to start talking about finding archival data and how and working it from the start of the project through its publication. So she'll be talking about a paper that her and I co-authored a few years back. And then Gabriel will take us from the quantitative spin into the qualitative side, talking a bit about getting access and collecting qualitative data, followed by Linus talking about insider quantitative management research. So we're going quant, qual, quant. So we're zigging and zagging today. So I invite all of our attendees to submit questions during the talk, but I will hold until the end to ask the questions of our panelists. So if something pops in your mind and you want to ask it, go ahead and put it in the chat. I'll be moderating that, and then towards the end, I'll then pick questions to ask. So we'll leave a few minutes to do that. All right, we can go ahead and get started. So we'll start with Bethany, and looking forward to hearing what she has to tell us about finding archival data that works.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this. I'm really happy to be here. I think this is such a very fun topic, so I'm also really glad to talk about it. So I'm going to start sharing my slides. But as I'm doing this, if I'm just curious, if anyone feels like sharing, if they want to introduce themselves and say either their interest in archival data or if they've ever used it, I'm curious. So no pressure. But if you want to share in the chat the experience you've had, or if you have interest or questions, I'm totally interested in that. So I'm just going to start sharing in just a second, but feel free to throw it in the chat if you choose. Is that visible to other people, Eric? Or is that not? Oh, forget it. Don't put it in the chat. I can't see it anyway. But I'm interested, just know I'm interested. All right, so I'm gonna start sharing you're gonna see it yourself for a second, possibly, and then it's going to look better, I promise. So I wanted to talk to you today a little bit about sort of the start to finish part of the process of archival data. And so I think it's really easy to think about archival data, if you're familiar with it, as this thing where you just sort of go in and you download data and then you have a publication. So I'm going to pause for a second. Can someone audibly tell me if they can see a screen that says, "And I will always love you"?
Oh, I can.
You cannot see it?
I can.
Yes.
You can. Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay. So I think that one of the parts of archival data that is to me so interesting is that on its face, it kind of looks really simple. You just get this data and then you analyze it and you write it up. Like it's sort of simple. But as you know, we'll talk about, there's a little more complexity to it. And there's a lot of tools out there that you can use to make it easier, but it's still not super easy, but just little things to look for that can make your life easier. And I do want to just double check that I have said, thank you so much for the invitation. And Eric, I know we'll be talking about you this whole time, but thank you so much for the invitation. So this is a little jokey meme about how I think sometimes people think of archival data. So this is based on a meme that was from South Park. So phase 1 is download the archival data. Phase 2 is we don't know. And phase 3 is profit or article published. So it's not necessarily that straightforward, but there are ways that we can make it a little more straightforward. So I want to talk a little bit about why not archival data. We're going to just have a quick conversation about starting with your research question and how that can help you decide if it should be archival or not. And then we're going to talk about, I didn't start my timer, guys, sorry. All right, we got this. Then we'll talk about how you can find archival data sets and then know which ones are the best ones for you. And then managing and analyzing that archival data, because it's a lot more management than most projects I've been on doing the archival management. And then just special considerations, especially for responding to reviewers. So why are we not archival data? So this is the most obvious why. So this is a JP that Eric and I published a few years ago. And this is the second, what I call death paper. So it's linking work characteristics to mortality. The first one was published in PSYCH. So we have these two. So I'm going to mostly talk about this second one because I think the story is easier to tell. And so we use the what's called the MIDAS. It's a Midlife in the United States survey to look at this data. We analyze this data to look at job characteristics and mortality as it relates through a couple mediators. So cool, right? That's a great why. The data was free. We just hit download. The data collection was pretty cool and powerful. It spanned decades. It was ready for us to hit download. We didn't have to wait for it. But the why nots look a lot like the whys. So it's not always free. So sometimes you have to pay for it. It's not always available. So a lot of the researchers will have a buffer time that they can use to publish on the data that they've collected. And so you're looking at data that can get kind of old sometimes. So it's older data. Sometimes you have to wait for it to actually be available for use. So there'll be a couple waves that are published. And then the third wave, they've already collected the data, but it won't be available for a few years. And so you're like, oh, that would be perfect, but it's not going to be available for a couple more years because the researchers have time to publish on it first. Or, some other reason that would be the case. The second, yes, it's cool data, but it's also massive data. You don't necessarily have control over the variables. So whereas we might want to study job demands in one way, someone who's collecting the data might study from their perspective, let's say sociology, they may study it in a different way. So they may ask different questions. And so there's not always parallels. And you don't always have control over the sample either, right? So we might want to ask the questions of certain people, but because we didn't collect the data, we didn't get to decide that. So there's like some special archival data are continually being collected and you can submit requests for questions to be added, but so that's the only like side thing. So sometimes that exists. And it's massive. So I was looking at the data for this paper I'm talking about, Death 2, and just this data for this data set, and it doesn't even have all the data in it, was over 1.35 gigs. This is a massive amount of data to sort through and to understand. And then it's also, yes, it's ready to download, but you have to like manage it and understand it. And I think that's the hardest part, is knowing what you have and how it fits together. What variables we should be picking. I think that's one of the biggest challenges of this. So whys and why nots, there's some goods, there's some bads. But overall, obviously, we really like using archival data. So then the second part is starting through research questions. So this is my personal opinion. And there are certainly people who would disagree with this, but I think the research question should be the most important driver of are we using archival data or not? So if we can't collect this data for some reason, but it's able to be collected by, we're able to use an archival version of it, then that's why we should do this. So for us, we were interested in mortality, and to be able to collect this data, some of these data sets had been being collected for over 40 years. And so like at one point, like we weren't even alive when they had started collecting the data. And so, that's something that we really couldn't do. And so I think that's a really powerful use of archival data. It's something we necessarily can't collect, but also there's some really cool perspectives from other fields that we can tap into for using archival data. So that's kind of another way that we might want to look at archival data, is if someone's collecting data in a way that we don't necessarily think of. So this specific study, so our first death study, we had 2 time points and we found a relationship between job demands and death. So we specifically found a moderating relationship. So when there's a job with high demands and low control, it was related to earlier death, and high demands and high control was related to a later death. But we didn't know anything about that in between, right? We didn't know about the relationship between job demands and control and mortality. We also had so we wanted at least 3 time points, and our sample wasn't very representative. So I believe the entire sample was from one state in the United States, and they were mostly white, and they were mostly graduated high school in like 1949. It was very, very narrow. So we wanted something that would allow us to have a little bit more demographic diversity. So this is why when we were thinking about what do we want to do next, we thought, okay, we'd like to expand this. We'd like to think about the mediators. We'd like to think about more representative sample, more time points. So that's what we started looking for in an archival data set. Okay, so I'm going to, just because it's so weird to just talk and not get any response. Linus, I'm looking at you. Can you hear me? Is everything going okay? All right, thank you for the thumbs up. I appreciate it. Um, so the next piece is finding the data, right? And so once you found it, how do you decide which one to use? So I just want to share a few things, and forgive me if everyone knows this already, but if you're not, I think these are just super great things to know about. So the biggest thing is to check out ICPSR. And we're going to go into their website just for a few slides, but this is a data repository that has a ton of data, like it has so many data sources. So go there, search, I'll show you what it looks like in a second. There's some governmental repositories with data. So like, I believe General Social Survey is considered a governmental repository, census.org, obviously. And just a side note, I want to say that I believe it's been since 2006 that if you receive a United States federal grant over a certain dollar amount, when you apply, you have to have a plan for archiving your data, and then you're required to archive it. And most of the people archive it in a way that is, at least some of it is publicly available, or all, but at least some of their data is publicly available. And that's part of the transparency process. It's part of a law that was written, I think 2006. So if you want a federal grant, you have to have a plan of over a certain dollar amount. You have to have a plan for how you're going to archive your data. This benefits us because now people are putting this data out. I have worked on a project that was over that dollar amount, and I've been on that side of archiving data, and I will tell you, it is really hard to do it well. It's not just you hit save on your SPSS data set and walk away. So like really well done data, and we'll talk about what you should look for, but has things like clear code books, the actual survey instruments. We'll talk more about that in a bit, but so yes, there's a ton of data out there, but a lot of it is borderline unusable because it's so poorly archived that you don't even know what the data is, who the people are, like what do you have from it. So part of this, I would say, loving your archival data really starts at that beginning point and making sure that you are getting a great data set that will like be perfect for you for the long haul. And then I just want to point out, I'm hoping everyone's familiar with this, but there's a thing called a crosswalk. So it basically allows you to link, if you know the time point a job existed and the title of the job, it will give you a bunch of variables that people have, like outsiders have assigned to each of the jobs. So like you're a CEO, then it'll give you a rating of like task interdependence and job control, I don't know, stuff like that. So if you, there are ways, if you get somebody's occupation, to add like sort of an objective, or at least a more objectively determined measure of the job and its demands and blah, 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 like a whole bunch of stuff. So I just want to like make sure you're aware of this so you can at least start thinking about it. It is also complicated because jobs have changed, the way they've done the data sets have changed, blah, blah, blah. But like it exists, and just let me know if you have questions. The last way to find possible data sources, I will say, is to check data sets and papers you like that are archival, and also look where their data is housed. So because there's multiple data repositories, the ICPSR is very commonly used. There's other data repositories for things like education and religion. So if you go in and you see a data set that you like, find out where they archived it, and then see if there's anything else there that you would like. Also, maybe that data set's got a lot of other variables that haven't been used yet. So maybe that data set can be perfect for you too. Okay. So let me just show you a little bit of what ICPSR looks like, and then we'll talk about how we picked our data set. So this is the website, and it may be really small, but just, you can see this logo here. And then I did a search for Midas and it pops right up at the top. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. But if you don't know what data set you're looking for, you can also put in keywords. So I put in mortality. So that's kind of, I don't know if you can see where my cursor is circling, but I put in mortality. Actually, I put it up here under studies, publications, variables, and search there. So what it does is it tells you how many studies it pulls up. So this is like 2,725 studies. You can go in and look at the variables. You can look at data related publications. And then this is how many pages that are on the ICPSR website that talk about mortality. And so when I did this, so I'm going to give you the study one first because it's more impressive. The Wisconsin longitudinal study that we use for the PSYCH was all the way down on item 275 on this list. It was way down the list on the 6th page. The MIDAS was the 28th, so not as bad. But if you were like, oh, I just want to know mortality, then, studies, then you're going to have a lot of work to do to get to the Wisconsin longitudinal study. But of course, there's ways to make it easier. So we did on a quick mortality and job, you can see MIDAS is the second one that pops up. So this is the mortality and job search result. This on the side, this time method is cool. I actually have not used this, at least I don't think this existed the last time I was here, but you can categorize by longitudinal, cross-sectional, etc. So MIDAS popped right up to the top when you just did a simple mortality and job search. So I want to point out how easy this is to use. It's just lovely. So how did we choose this data set? So I think this is one of the 2 most important steps to make sure you keep loving what you're doing with this archival data. So we loved the MIDAS data set because it had the right data we needed. We needed job demands, job control, mortality, some interesting mediators. We wanted some good control variables, which we knew from our previous study, what they were going to ask for and from what the literature had recommended. We wanted something that had really high quality scales. So this is one of the problems with a lot of archival data is you'll go in and you'll go, okay, this says it's talking about depression, but this measure of depression is not a good measure. Like it's not a measure that clinicians would recognize. It's not reliable. It's not valid. It's never been tested beyond this study. So that happens in a lot where they'll just make up a scale and put it in, and it's really not a solid scale. Or maybe it is, maybe we don't know yet. But if you can use something that's really already a tight, good scale, then that's something I look for personally. Good timing. So ours was very special because we wanted to look at mortality, and because we know from the allostatic load model, it takes time for stress to translate into earlier death. It's not like the next day, a stressful day at work, and then the next day you die. It's that it usually unfolds over a long course of time. So we needed a data set that was long, had the right timing. And that's something you also have to look for. Like, does it make sense that we are having these data variables at these time points? And there's definitely some scales or some data sets we looked at, things are reversed. So we needed this thing first and this thing second, and it had it reversed. And so we couldn't use it. So it looked like it's a really great data set. It has the variables we needed, and then they're at the wrong time points, or they weren't spaced out enough. Okay. And so this is the correct data that was key, and the first thing we had to first hurdle we had to go on over. The data, and so this is an example of this was American Changing Lives. So this is one we had looked at. It has like 5 time points that span 1986 to 2011. It was, it was just a really solid, it looked like a really solid data set. But then once we started looking at it, it didn't have the right data in it. So what we thought was going to be job demands wasn't actually job demands, and job control wasn't measured how we thought it was going to be. So it ended up not being useful, but we went well down that path before we found out it just wasn't working. Data that has good documentation. So this is a personal preference, but I strongly recommend it because I think it helps throughout the whole process, including the review process. Really clear code books that are laid out so you know what the variables are, they'll give you if then. So like basically if they do yes on this answer, do they even answer this question? It's super helpful. Really good code books will tell you how many people answered each question. They'll give you the variable name. They'll give you if things were reverse coded or should be reverse coded, or if they're part of larger subscales, they'll give you the citations. Like a solid code book will make your life so much better. Downloading the actual PDF of the surveys. So a lot of these surveys were done in person, and so there's a paper version, or at a minimum you can see a PDF of the survey. I know that sounds like why do you need that if you have the code book, but it's really visual. So you can see, this is the first question we asked people, this is the second question, this is a third question, and if they said no to this, then we skip this whole section. So it gives you this really nice visual way to understand what you're looking at and make sense of this like massive amount of data. So the timelines are also super helpful. And I'm going to show you a few examples of the timelines and the participant flows in a second. But the timelines are super helpful because some of these things they're not labeled in a way that you would intuitively know. So like biomarker data, when did they collect that? But if you can see the timeline of when each thing was collected, then you see where the biomarker data fits in. Whereas like if you see survey 1, survey 2, survey 3, like that makes more sense. That's more intuitive. But if you don't have that for a pet, like, you know, there's a twin study. Well, what happened with the twin study? So that's where you would like fit in, you know, some of this information, and it would like make more sense when you can actually see this timeline. Super helpful. Another thing to look for is a participant flow. And I'll show you an example of that in a second, but it basically gives you this idea of what are the demographics, how many people completed each section, when did they take the survey related to like when other people took it. They look different in not every survey, but like there are different versions of this. I'll just show you ours. Then a bonus is if they give you a listing of publications based on their data and access to additional data with their permission. And so we had this, it's really nice because they'll often categorize it by topic, and it allows you to see, oh, what are some cool topics that are in this data? But also it's like kind of the first check to make sure someone hasn't already used your variables, because it's a really hard sell to use archival data that other people have already analyzed in the same way you're analyzing it. And so you just kind of make sure that no one else has done this yet. It's just a double, triple check to make sure you're not going to end up wasting a bunch of time by the end. But that one is hard because they're often reliant on the researchers to submit to them. And so you still need to do your own check, because if a researcher doesn't submit, it's still on you if you're analyzing data that's already been analyzed before in this specific way you're analyzing it. So I don't know if that made sense, but so then another piece is there are sometimes these big data sets will have little like extra special data that you can access if you get special permission. And so we had the biomarker data that we had to get special permission for. And this might be, in our case, we had to run it through the IRB, even though we had no idea who the data was, but because it was such sensitive medical data, we had to run it through our IRB and then submit the IRB and say we would like access to the data, and they sent it to us. There's some that's even more locked down than that. Like you have to go through training and like be part of their group, and some you can never access. They won't even give it to you. So there's just different levels of it. So I want to go really quickly back to the data with good documentation, because I forgot to tell you. So we had another data set we got really interested in. It was called the Longitudinal Study of Generations. It's like 8 time points spanning 1971 to 2005. And it looked like it was going to be great. But the more we got into it, it was super messy, and it was hard to see because it was a generational study of like, you know, grandparent, parent, child, sibling, like it had a ton of layers to it. So we were realizing that the things that we wanted were not always asked to the same people. So we may have one person's job control and a different person's job demands, and they were all at different time points. And the whole thing was just sort of messy. It would work for something else. It just didn't work for this specific study. So that leads me to the last point I want to make on this slide is keep a nice little list of data that you're interested in going back to someday. I see yes, I believe yes, as if that's okay with people, what people are saying. I'm fine sharing my slides. So this is a, you know, just keep a running list. Like I have these like websites these data sets I'm in love with and haven't used yet because this hasn't, like the right project hasn't come up. But I kind of always, while I'm out poking around and looking at stuff, I'm always thinking like, hey, what would this be useful for? And I just have a running list. Okay, so I have 4 more slides in this section, and then I'll pause and see if anybody wants me to do questions or if we're good with whatever. I could see something popping up. I don't know what it was. So I just want to show you what the Midas looks like, because I think in some ways this is a sort of ideal version. Most data sets do not have their own website. Most data sets do not have their own like tech support and research support. This is fantastic. So if you can find this, go for it. But and also maybe check out the Midas. Something just got published from the Midas that was fantastic. And it's anyway, so there's still a lot in the Midas to use. And there's more data coming out that hasn't even been published yet. So okay. So this is the Midas front page, and I'm realizing it's probably too small, so I'm going to talk through it a little. So they have an about the study for researchers, for the general public, and a contact. And under the for researchers, they have a data collection timeline, how you access the data. They have a special repository for genetic data and neuroscience data. Then they have their publications, and I'll show you one of those in a little while. So this is where you can look and see what has been published under certain topics. And then they have, what are the things that I love? They have participant flow, and I'll show you that in a second. And yeah, I think that's it. So data collection timeline and participant flow, I'll show you in just a second. So this is the timeline, and it is just, it's very beautiful. Some of them are way more convoluted than this. And I will tell you, this looks nice and straightforward, but it's actually kind of more convoluted than it looks here. But it's still pretty good. So if you can't see this, on the left side, it's -1, in the middle is -2, and on the far right is -3. So those are the 3 time points. And then those are further broken down to get more specific with the years that they took place. So for example, or the months and years. So I mean, this is so small for me, so hopefully you guys can see it though. So biomarker data, which we used, was collected between 2017 and 2021. And this is, it says the number of people are 747. So, you know, that's, I think everything is sort of approximate. But this is just a nice visual. So you can go, okay, so wait, when was what collected? And you can see the years, and sometimes you can see the months, and they're not always this beautiful. They're still beautiful usually, or they're always helpful. They're not always this beautiful, but you know, you can really see the overlap. And so, okay, some people might have started -1 at this time point. Other people might have actually started it. So the refresher, they might have started it years later. And then there's another refresher that started years after that. So it'll just sort of give you a nice picture. So check that out. And I'm going to zoom in this in a second, but this is the participant flow. So this is sort of the order they take things, they would take the study in, and it gives you the number of people who took each piece. So I want to zoom really fast into just the cognitive project. So this one, you know, it tells you the sample size, 4,500. It tells you which sample they came from, the eligibility criteria. They had to have taken the module 2 interview. It includes the response rate, that some basic demographics. And so this is just really helpful. You don't rely on any of this, but like use it as a check to make sure that when you get your data that you're not merging something wrong, or that you're not missing something important. It also can answer questions when you go, why did 1/3 of my sample disappear? Oh, they didn't get it. This is not everyone received this piece. So we had that with our biomarker data. Only a very small section of the entire sample received it. And so we were just like, okay, we have to work with this. We don't have anyone else to work with. And so it was one of those moments where you're like, we're not stressed because you knew you're about ready to lose a whole bunch of power, or like a bunch of data. So anyway, okay, so I'm ready to move to the next section, which is tips for managing and analyzing archival data. I'm gonna look at the screen again. And now you can see who I'm looking at. Hoda, Eric, I can see your face. Do you need me to do anything different? Do I need to?
Nope, you're good. You've got 11 minutes, so you can
Okay.
you can keep going. We can go to questions, whatever you like. I don't
Okay,
see any here now, so you can probably keep chugging along, and then I can ask some stuff towards the end.
Perfect. Okay, I will. Yes. How did time fly so much? Okay, thank you. So tips for managing and analyzing archival data. I think that selecting the variables is like the hardest / most important step. We had to sift through a lot of data. We had over 7,000 variables to start. We had different samples answering different parts of the question, especially for the Wisconsin longitudinal study, the WLS that we used for the PSYCH. It was very pieced together who got what. So only like 1/3 of the sample would get job demands, 1/3 would get job control, or 2/3 would get job demands, 2/3 would get job control. They weren't always the same set. We had to learn medical terminology to be able to calculate things correctly, because we used the allostatic load model, and that talked about different like really important like pieces of the body. We had to like learn what that was, so we didn't reverse code something we shouldn't. We had to make sure the cognitive ability measure was perfect, like it was very reliable, because there's some really bad ones out there. Like the depression measure items, we had to make sure they're right. Foreshadowing, I screwed up. I will tell you about that in a second. But we went through, like, we got pretty deep into 3 data sets before we ended up with this one. Early stages of selecting variables. read through the website, like we just talked about, check the README files. Like I'm always like, no, I don't need to read it. It says README. No, seriously, read it. It's super helpful. So they'll usually give you a README file in their, like when you download the folders, like ICPSR does that for, I think, everything. So make sure you download the code book, the survey instruments. So like if you can actually see the interviews, do that. Look at additional documentation if it's available. Look at relevant published papers for ideas for possible variables to use or to avoid. The only way we could really sort through this is we had to create an Excel document with scale, subscales, sample size, time points, and then, so you might see job demands, and it might be for you. It might be for your past job, your current job, your future job. You might have for your parents' jobs. That was one of them. So you might have this, that wasn't job demands, it was a different thing. But so there's all these variables that it can include. It could talk about your current health, your past health, your anticipated future health. So like you have to put all these together and make sure that the right people answered them. So you may not be able to analyze the data if person A only answered one of the questions and then none of the others. Yeah, the Excel document is helpful for seeing everything laid out that we, and then we created a clean data set based on what we thought were the highest likelihood of good variables. This is just a quick, this is what the bibliographies of the MIDAS data, this is where people submitted their published articles. So affect emotion, aging, allostatic load, that's how we kind of had a general idea of what was in there. We selected the MIDAS because it had what we wanted, 3 time points spanning 20 years. It had the variables we wanted. It was a very large sample and it was a little more diverse. We had over 700 participants for our smallest analysis. Had the job demands and control. The mental health measure was superb. The physical health measure needed special permission, so I felt very special that we got to use it. There's a solid measure of cognitive ability. They provided death status. Obviously, we had to have that. The data set was beautiful. There's clear documentation, and researchers were available when we had questions. So I emailed, we had to email a few questions. So we downloaded the data around, I think I've got a typo on here about participant number, but around 7,000 variables that by the very, very end of our whole thing, we're down to 20 variables. So there's a lot of, we had to compute, we had to reverse code, we had to do a bunch of stuff to get down to a small number, but that's a lot of sorting. That's a lot of understanding where all this data is. And once you do it, it's totally worth it. You complete the typical data checks for normality, et cetera. You compute your scales, then you recompute them when you realize Bethany made a mistake. So this was a problem of timing. So I was looking at the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, from a more recent version, and they were using, because when they collected the data, it was an older version of the DSM. So I had the wrong compute in, basically. I missed a variable. So we ended up getting more participants and it was happy, but luckily no one killed me. Thank you, Eric, for not killing me. That was so scary. And then, checking reliability, so doing the confirmatory factor analysis ahead of time, they're going to ask you for, so do it. So when you go back in later, you don't regret it. And then document everything. This is even more important, I think, because you really need to understand what you did because it's so much data. And then trying to anticipate reviewer problems. We were lucky because we'd had the previous reviewer comments and also the rejection at another place to know what people were going to say and what concerns they were going to have. All right. And because we also can't recreate this data, it's not like we can go back and be like, ooh, let's add another prolific sample that we wait 40 years for. It's just not a thing. So you have to really document, really anticipate, make sure you're not going into something that's got low probability of working out for the reviewers. All right, almost done. Responding to reviewers, I just wanted to say, this is going to look familiar to everybody. Not a big enough contribution. We heard that from our first paper that ended up getting a ton of popular press. I think it made a difference and it resonated for people. We got that from the second paper, the one that ended up at JP, not a big enough contribution. And so we were given different options for how to respond to that. I can talk about those later if you're interested. We were asked to analyze the data differently. So we tried it in multiple ways and it's a lot of data to maneuver. So it was interesting and a fun challenge. We also, for the first paper, ended up having to collect expert ratings because our scale wasn't exactly what a demand scale would look like. They wanted us to make sure that we're using a demand scale that experts agreed is a demand scale because it wasn't one of the pre-written ones. And we were given, of course, improve the hook. So these are things that like look and feel similar, but the way you respond is a little different. Okay, so in sum, I believe, so I think the reason that this worked was that we had a topic we really couldn't research any other way than archival data, or at least archival data really enriched what we were talking about. It was an interesting topic to some people, and it had some nice practical implications. I think that really helped. And the other thing that really helped is that the first author is brilliant. Hi, Eric. So I think that really, those are the things that really led us to this perfect solution. Back to the beginning, you just have to download the data, do phase 2, and then your article is published. So let me know if you have questions. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you guys. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you, Bethany. So there's one question in the chat. So Jake is asking, if you find interesting variables while you're looking through potential archival data sets, would modifying your research question or adding those variables into the study be problematic? So kind of a hypothesizing after results are known type question. So how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, this is, honestly, this is the hard question, right? I mean, I think my feeling is if it's theoretically, if it makes sense, and you can build the logic around that, especially if you're transparent, like, so once you're in the review process, like if you're transparent about this, so this is where our cognitive ability was not in our original data, it wasn't in our original paper, and they wanted another mediator. And so we looked through the data and went, there's this amazing cognitive ability. Eric studies individual differences. It makes sense theoretically. And so the reviewers asked for it and we said, okay, this is what we found. What do you think? And so we had a conversation with the reviewers and they were, they liked it. It obviously it worked out. I think it's always going to be a hard call because you're going to have somebody come in and go, never, never, never. And you'll have someone come in and say, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And so for me, it's sort of in the middle of, if you can have a transparent conversation with your reviewers, then, and they're okay with it and you're, very upfront about it, I feel like that's reasonable. So our first paper, we had a supplementary analysis where we talked about BMI, body mass index. And so it was considered supplementary analysis and I felt comfortable with it, but that's my perspective. And I'm open to if anyone else, maybe if anyone else wants to weigh in on that, or if Eric has thoughts or feelings.
Yes, something I would add, Jake, it's a great question. I think when you do archival data, when you're doing research using archival data, it lends itself to a more abductive process, I would say, because of that. So the way that we've approached this is we have a general research question. We find a data set that we think has variables that can speak to it. We essentially, we're lucky that our a priori theory was supported in these cases, but also not. So if you look at those papers, there's actually the data is quite messy. So like there's parts of the hypothesis that were supported, parts that weren't. But in both of those cases, we approached it with an open-ended research question with specific variables in mind. And then the archival data, really what it does is it guides your selection of variables to represent the constructs. Because when the Midas collected these data, like they weren't thinking someone's going to test this model with it, right? So we came up with this model first. We kind of found the Midas that has data that could help support or could help test that model. And then we're looking through the Midas and finding variables that could map onto the constructs, right? So like if you read the paper, the construct is mental health. And then we're thinking, okay, what measure could we use to represent mental health? And then it just so happens the Midas is this really good depression measure, right? So we use that. I would say that once I think that is all appropriate because we're approaching this with an a priori model, a priori research questions, and theory that we're then testing with the data. Now, if you just open up a data set and say, I wonder what's in here and how I can kind of reverse engineer this thing, that's a different thing. And not that it's not appropriate, you just have to disclose if you're doing that, right? So if you just fired up a data set and went backwards from the variables that were there, as long as you're upfront about it and transparent and say, this is what I did, and you don't have a priori hypothesis, that's okay as well. So I think it's kind of this mix of approaching the data or approaching the data with an a priori set of expectations and being transparent about that with the reviewers and with the readers. So yeah, and to Bethany's point, when they asked about the individual differences construct, their ask was very generic. And then we came back and said, okay, they want us to incorporate individual differences, like what makes sense, right? So we go back to the literature, then we actually came up with a separate question, like, it kind of makes sense that, any of these potential constructs would operate in the way they're suggesting. And then lo and behold, there was a measure of one of those constructs in the data set. We tested it, it supported the our a priori hypothesis, and then it's in the paper, right? So, that's different from, oh, they asked us for individual differences. Let's just like test everything that's in there and see what works, and then slap it in the paper later, right? Like that's a different thing. But it's a good question, Jake. All right, well, we're out of time for Bethany's part, and if there's other questions, if we've got a little time at the end, we can take those for Bethany as well. So we'll move on now to Gabriel. So Gabriel's going to be talking about qualitative data. So please, Gabriel, take it away.
All right. Can you all see? All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Well, first, thanks a lot. Thank you, Hoda. Thank you, Herrick, for having me. I'm so excited to be part of this consortium, and I want to say I feel very lucky and proud to represent the qualitative world. I'll do my best in the time that I have to tell you a little bit about how to get access and collect qualitative data. As I'm very much still a baby researcher in some ways, I just wanted to tell you a little more about who I am and what I do before we dive in. So, well, my name is Gabriel Sala. I'm a field worker, and I've been involved in projects using participant and non-participant observation that we're going to talk about a little bit later. And I've done quite a few projects using interviews. I realized that I'm not going to talk about archival data, although you can absolutely do qualitative methods using archival material. As qualitative research is often linked, there's a lot of ties between analysis and collecting the data. And I know that next week's workshop is with Stina Gordell, who is an excellent person to talk about archival methods. I will not talk about archival today, but I do encourage you to ask her questions about analyzing archival material for qualitative research next week. As far as my work goes, I tend to look at contexts that are considered extreme, either because they're high risk, emergency, or disrupted. And in terms of theories, I tend to go towards identity meaning, emotions and mental health, and relationships. So our agenda for today. So I'm not going to give you a complete a complete view of each part of collecting qualitative data. We could spend hours just on each of those points. So what I want to give you is hopefully a few resources, and I'm happy to share my slides at the end so that you have the slides with the different sites and references, but also give you some examples from my own work when talking about each of this kind of data. And then I'll finish with some concluding thoughts and we move on to Q&A. I'll try to be as quick as I can to leave you time to ask questions and so that I can answer them live. So you want to do a qualitative project. So you're thinking, I'm assuming that you're thinking of a research questions that matches or that requires you to collect some type of qualitative data. So whether it's interviews or observations. And the first thing that you'll need to do is to get access to an organization or a context. And the three things or the three key things that you have to think about when thinking about getting access is your network, being lucky, and persistence. And to illustrate that, I want to tell you like three different stories from my friends and myself in how we approached getting access to different to different contexts for our papers. One of my friends just literally contacted the alumni network from our school. It was a great way to get access to a manager that opened up the organization for him, and he was able to collect interviews and do observations. This is really something to think about, looking at your network, looking at who you know, and who you could contact that may be in your close or a little bit further in your network, but that you could reach out to get access. And this is one of the first things to think about. The second and very important part of getting access is just being lucky. And one of the example I have is The project that I'm going to talk a little bit more about today was an anti-terrorist unit in France. I have no background in the military, and I got access by cold calling the organization, saying that I was interested in doing research. And I was just lucky to find someone who was willing to let me in, let me do a few interviews, building a good rapport with that organization. And that's how I got access to my first study. And the last part is persistence. And the last story I'm going to tell you, which is probably more common, is one of my friends probably spent an entire summer reaching out to 100+ organizations, sending emails, calling before she was lucky enough to get the companies that were needed to start collecting the data for dissertation. So again, 3 big components that exist and trying to keep in mind when trying to get access. The next thing to think about, and Bethany started talking about it, is IRB, and that is going to push you to start thinking about who you're going to talk to. So what is going to be your sample? What is the population studied? Obviously, if you're talking to certain populations like people in prison or children, I mean, that's unusual in our field, but that might require more work to do an IRB. But also start thinking about what kind of topic you're studying, what kind of questions you're going to ask, and what is your purpose of for your observation, if anything. What are you going to observe, and why are things that you need to think about? All of that to end up having a consent form and showing that you will get consent from people, that you're not going to hide to observe them when they're not willing to be observed, but you're not going to ask questions that they're going to be too uncomfortable answering. So these are important things to consider for IRB. And the final point about getting access is you need to build your access and maintain it over time. Qualitative research takes time, and access is definitely a dynamic thing over time. So you need to gain trust and try to keep that trust over time with the organization. Something that happened through my time as an observer. There was a change in leadership. The new leader didn't like what I was doing, and I really had to struggle and negotiate to keep my access alive. One of the questions that you might want to ask yourself, directly linked to that point, is what can I offer this organization? That may be a struggle for qualitative researchers, because we can't really say that we're going to add a couple of questions to a survey that may be of interest to the organization. But I think if the topic in and of itself that you're studying might be of interest to the organization, you could provide a review of that topic, or you can give a presentation at the end of your research around practical conclusions that you may get from your time as an observer or from the interviews that you've done. These are a few hints of what you could do. So these are a few sites. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those, and I will send it to the organizers at the end. So you've decided to do some interviews. Now, interviews are very useful if you're trying to get at people's perceptions and expressed feelings. So talking about how they feel about their work, how they see their work, what they do, what they think about XYZ is going to be what answers your research question. Something that's important to think about when interviewing is you may face resistance from the people you're talking to. They may want to lie to you, or one of the first example that I had with a difficult interview was a person who just completely refused to engage with me and have a conversation, answered with the yes or no answers, or very, very short answers. And I had to completely pivot the interview to try and have a completely different conversation and see how I could salvage as much data as possible. But being aware that some people might be more or less willing to talk to you about certain things are things to take into account when doing interviews. After that, you need to think about what type of interview you're doing. So you will design a protocol or not, depending on how structured you want your interview to be. Some might be extremely structured, where you're going to ask the same questions to people. Most of the time in qualitative research, we will engage in semi-structured interviews, which means that you will have a set of questions, but you may go on tangents, which is the point below. Whenever the person says something interesting that you hadn't thought about, you can ask more questions about that particular thing and completely derail from the protocol that you had. Or what may happen in ethnographic work when you're in the field and you're just having conversations with people, and these would be considered unstructured interviews. You'll have obviously several tools for your interviews to record what is going on. You may have a notebook, you may have a recording device, you can have a camera, a computer. You'll have to think about whether the interview is going to be in person or virtual. That might have an impact on how you're conducting the interview, and also the location of that interview. You're going to be in a formal setting, in an office? Are you going to be in a park, in a restaurant? In which case, are people going to be hearing you? Or are there going to be too much noise for you to record? These are important things to think about when you're trying to collect interviews. And finally, you also have ethical considerations. So things that may happen is you might have people telling you things that are very personal that you didn't ask for, or feel like they should not be recorded. These are things that you should be prepared to face when you're conducting interviews, and try to address it before it happens, even if it may be hard. But people might be very unexpectedly open and tell you things that they've done that you may not want to know about, and these are things to think about when conducting interviews. The other thing that involves more the researcher is the emotional context that you may be in. So some interviews might be more extreme than others, or you may see people that are in emotional states that may be more challenging than others. And one of the examples that I had in my dissertation, I was talking to people working in the hospitality industry, and one of my informants, Alice, told me that she didn't feel valued, and things like, I've become worthless. She started breathing heavily. She started crying, and then she started visibly shaking. So that person was visibly in distress. When we're faced with this situation, I realized that I hadn't been really trained to deal with this, and also it affected me as a person as well. These are things that I'm working on with a colleague of mine on interviewing in extreme contexts or emotionally heavy contexts. Try to think about your community and the people that are around you that are doing this type of research. Reach out to those people, and obviously preparing tools in advance. In this case, I had to reach out to a clinical psychologist and see like what were things that I could give people as potential tools for them to feel better in case that it happened again, just to give you an example. So the last thing after you've done a few interviews is thinking about, well, when is it okay for me to stop interviewing people? When is it done? And the only thing I wanted to mention is you may hear different numbers for how many interviews are enough to do for a particular paper or for a particular publication. I would say that there is no magic number, and it's not usually the right way to think about collecting interviews. The way you would do it is really thinking about saturation as I'm not learning anything new with the protocol that I have. So by asking those questions, I always hear the same things over and over again. And once I've iterated enough with my protocol and I've learned enough things that allows me to build my theory, then that's usually a sign that you've reached saturation and you can stop collecting more data. That is not tied to a particular number. So starting with a number or having a number in mind might not always be super useful. Again, these are some resources that you may use for conducting interviews if you're interested. Some are foundational pieces that I'm happy to share. The last thing that I'm going to talk about is doing observations. So there are quite a few things to think about when doing observations or engaging in ethnographic work where you're in the field looking at what people are doing. So in this case, you're trying to see what people do. You're looking at behavior. One of the problems, just like for interviews, is people might change their behavior by having you around. And so the fact that you're there and how you're going to be there is going to be super important. And it's going to impact what you're going to be able to collect and what people are going to be telling you or how they're going to behave with you. So you'll have to think about what type of observation you're doing. And that there are two key components. One is how involved you're going to be in the context, how much of a participant you're going to be. So if you're a full participant, you're like working for the company. For example, action research is a type of pure participant type. Or you're a pure observer, you're sitting in a park and you're looking at people walking by, or you're looking from afar at a crowd, that would be a pure observation type. Most of the time, you're going to be a participant observer or an observer participant, which means that you're going to be embedded in the context with an observer role or vice versa. And you can also disclose more or less about your research. That will impact how covert or overt your research is. And usually, again, you will do something that's in between where people are going to know that you're a researcher, but not necessarily exactly what you're looking for. And that's usually best for them not to change their behavior to match what you want to see. Something that an example that I wanted to share with you that I think embodies what it means is my time as a semi-overt participant observer. When I was doing the selection process of the anti-terrorist unit that I was observing, and as you can see in the pictures, I have just half my face that is painted, which was for the instructor there to acknowledge that I was still the researcher, and so that I wouldn't look completely like a participant and a candidate. But at the same time, I also had half of my face painted so that the candidates could feel that I was with them and that I was going through the same experiences as they did. You also have different tools for observations. Obviously, your eyes are just super important. You'll have a notebook, a recorder as well, maybe a camera to record everything that's going on. But another thing that's super important when doing observations is what is called commitment acts. And that is what is going to allow you to get potentially more access, is those activities that are going to help you get more trust from people that you're studying. One of the example that I'm going to give, and then obviously you're going to use those what you're collecting to record them and start memoing. You can do diaries, written, audio, video, and collect photos and videos. And this is what it could look like for the anti-terrorist studies. This is where I was. These are some of the pictures of where I was doing the observations. And these are some of the activities that I did as a participant observer. In the middle, I was doing a tear gas exercise. On the right, I was doing a claustrophobia test. And the other ones are jumping from a bridge and being in the water. These allowed me to really show that I was willing to be with the candidates, and I had a huge impact on my interviews later on and my observations, as people trusted me more and wanted to talk to me more. So that was super important. Finally, obviously, some ethical consideration, and when is it fine to get away from the field? There are two things that are important here. One is a well-known phenomenon called the risk of going native. So if you're embedded in a context for too long, you tend to potentially take their side more and more and forget that you're a researcher. And that's where the role of the community becomes super important. And it is important that you share what you're doing with other colleagues or with people that you're in touch with, so that they can ground you and remind you what you're doing there, and also tell you when you've observed enough and that you're probably ready to start analyzing before doing more observations. So again, the role of the community is super important. A few more resources. This one is for observation. I have a chapter with Mike Pratt, my advisor, that is a toolkit where we have also a lot more references. These ones are more for ethnographic work, where you will have both observations and interviews. But you will also get to see more about the methods in itself. And so I just wanted to conclude with some thoughts. So the first thing is, collecting qualitative data is long and hard. Obviously, it requires that you develop some observation skills, some interviewing skills. It takes time and effort to do that. And as I said before, you may have to negotiate with IRB depending on what kind of populations you're studying or what kind of questions you're asking, but also negotiating with your access and the organization over time to keep that access alive. But collecting qualitative data is an amazing way to find a community that can help you craft amazing paper, meet fascinating people, and be embedded in unique context. Also, stepping out of academia and stepping into organizations and seeing people makes you more connected to the field. It's also a great way to bring your work into the class and having more examples that are different and having unique perspectives. And finally, it's something that Stina Gerdau probably will touch on more than me, but collecting qualitative data also opens up for other projects, whether more qualitative research or quantitative work, which I found particularly exciting. And with that, thank you very much for listening to me, and I'll be waiting for your questions.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. We've got a couple in the chat from Eugen. So he asked about once an organization gives you access, should you still maintain connections with them, even though they, with the rest of the organization that denied you access? And he's wondering if you think about that and what's the way that you go about maintaining those connections.
So if the organization denies you access?
Yeah, the question says, Eugen, could you clarify? Because it says, the first part says, once they give you access, and it says, should you still maintain connection relations with the rest of the organization that denied you access? So maybe we can go to the second part of his question while he's reformulating that a little bit. So he asked about how you take field notes. So he asked if there's some must-dos in taking good field notes, the best practices.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. Obviously, it really depends on the context that you're in. It's a skill that will take quite a bit of time to develop. So taking notes, when you're lucky to be in a setting where you can take notes, have your notebook with you. You will usually start by having very broad, and there is a chapter that talks about going from broad to narrow. You'll start by writing anything that you see around you. You'll start by noticing things and try to be aware of your own biases, and then analyze what you've seen. So usually during the first few days, your notes are going to be about whatever it is that you feel is most interesting or most salient in the setting that you're in. And it's by going back to those notes and saying, I tend to really look at, I don't know, how people do X or how people do Y. And by talking to other colleagues, they might tell you, well, have you thought about looking at this? That sounds interesting. Or what were they doing when you were doing X or Y or Z? And that's going to have an impact in your note taking. You will do memoing at the same time, meaning you will write, the kind of the facts or what is going on in front of you, what you see, but also what it makes you think of for theoretical things or things to read about, which is why it's always going to be an iteration between being in the field and taking notes and then going into the literature or talking to people about what you're observing. That's one thing to think about when taking notes. I was in a context where taking notes when you're on a mission, for example, or when you're going out is impossible, and you can't really bring a recorder with you. So sometimes I would just have to wait and do a video diary when I was back and just talk as much as I could about what happened, give as much information, and do the same process. But there are more ways than taking notes by hand or with your computer. You can use a lot of different tools to facilitate that.
Thanks so much, Gabriel. All right, and Eugen resubmitted his question. So he asked, that once you find your site, should you maintain connections with other organizations that have denied you access to keep future opportunities open? And how do you go about doing that?
Oh, if you find another site,
I
yeah.
think if it's you tried, like if you tried multiple, you were shut down by some and then got an in with one, do you still try to maintain relationships with those that said no?
That's a good question. I mean, it really depends on what your research question is and how many sites you need to get access to. If one is enough, then but some organizations might be interesting for you in the future, then of course you should potentially try to reach out later if it's something that you're passionate about, or you think there is a very interesting research question that matches a particular context. Then it's always okay to try and stay in touch or try to connect with that context. Using different methods. Again, sometimes it's not the right time or the right place. Sometimes you think that you have access and something happens and you lose it. It's really a combination of the three things I said at the beginning: your network, how lucky you are, and how persistent you may be. But if it's something that you're passionate about, I would say that, yeah, you can try and stay connected to the ones that denied you at first, because they might open up later on.
Thank you. All right, then the last question, or there's two more questions. So one asked about whether it's permissible to gather data from individuals in multiple organizations if the research question doesn't focus on a specific context. And I'm also curious how you set that up in the paper. Like, if you set that up as a feature, or is it just something that you mention, like, oh, there were multiple organizations, period? How do you go about managing that?
I mean, an easy example is a study of occupations that cut across different organizations. My dissertation was with hotel concierges. Hotel concierges exist in multiple hotels, and I interviewed people that were in different hotels. They're just all part of different organizations. If you were to do a study of business school professors, you would talk to people that are from different universities, different organizations. That would still be a paper that's highly publishable. So I don't think it's a problem. Again, it really depends on what kind of phenomenon you're interested in. If you're studying an occupation, it's going to be weird if you're just talking to one organization. It's going to be a problem if you're talking to just one organization. So it really depends on what your research questions calls for.
Yeah, and I would even add to that, I'm not a qualitative expert by any means, but I've seen, so Kathy Eisenhart does a lot of this, where she actually like specifically samples from different organizations and does comparative analyses. So, to Gabriel's point, it just depends what the question is. Like, your question could deliberately be interested in making qualitative comparisons across contexts, and then you'll have to sample from those different contexts.
Also, Kathy Eisenhart does case studies or case methods, which is also a thing in and of itself as well. I do encourage you to look into it. It has some overlap with what I've said, but it will require some specific methodological aspects that she develops in her papers. But yes, it's a good example of picking multiple cases.
Yeah, thank you, Gabriel. And then the last question. So Grace asked about what are some of the major biases associated with qualitative research, and how can these biases be avoided?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are two things that are important when thinking about biases. I mean, one, you have to acknowledge that they exist. They're always going to be there. Some, depending on how embedded you are in the organization, you might be super biased, or depending on how familiar you are with the setting, you might have preconceptions that are very important. One of the key thing to do to fight those is the community of qualitative researchers that you have around you. Again, presenting your work and talking about what you're looking will tell you a lot about what your biases are. And obviously getting training both in interviewing, in knowing how to ask questions, how to ask follow-up questions, knowing how to take notes when you're observing in ways that are not overly biased. One of the examples that I had when taking one of my first class, one assignment was to just like sit in a public space and try to observe things and then send our notes to the professor. And the professor, one of my notes said that there was a married couple sitting at a coffee table having coffee. And I was asked, well, how do you know they were married? And I said that I saw they had a ring on their hand, and I was told that the correct way to take notes would have been that I saw two people wearing rings sitting at the table, because I didn't ask them if they were married or not. So I was just assuming they were based on my observation. So this is just a silly example to say that we do a lot of those things all the time, and by having other people look at your work and look at how you're working, you can really correct and address like some of those biases that you're having. But that's the whole point of the publishing process. Even when you send your paper and people review your work, they will tell you if there is anything wrong or anything sounds fishy in how you collected the data. If they feel like some of the assumptions that you're making are wrong, this is part of the process. Qualitative work is a lot of back and forth. It's a lot of going back and forth between the data and your research questions and theories.
All right, thank you so much, Gabriel. If there aren't other questions, we can move on to Linus, and then I'll keep the question for Bethany at the end, where we can kind of take questions for everyone. So I will get to your question, Grace. We'll just wait till Linus is done. So I'll give people just another few seconds if they have other questions for Gabriel, and if not, we'll move on. All right, Linus, the floor is yours. Thank you.
You can see my slides now, right?
Yes, perfect.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the organizers. I'm Linus. I'm presenting something that I care very deeply about, which is insider quantitative management research. Before I begin, I have a disclaimer. I've been teaching full days for 5 or 6 consecutive days. So I've been falling asleep in the sofa at about like 8 p.m. every evening. And now it's 7:10 in Berlin. So I don't think I'm going to fall asleep, but I'm just to the point where I'm incredibly exhausted at the moment. And the way that I'm going to present this is that I'm going to give you an example from a recent project on that I've done inside a large company in collaboration with a company where they provided access, and in this particular case, an experiment. And then I'm going to talk about something else which I sometimes call our crazy pandemic project, in the sense that this is something that we probably shouldn't have done to begin with, but we did it out of our own curiosity and how to organize these kinds of collaborations more effectively. They have some amazing collaborations, but let me give you one of these recent examples. And this is a paper that just came out in SMJ. On one level, I think it is a success because we managed to get access to the data. We had good ideas what we wanted to do. We worked with someone who was a partial insider who could provide us very detailed information. We had the opportunity to talk to people, get a good qualitative understanding of the context, but also conduct a quantitative field experiment inside this particular organization. We did pretty much all the right things, I think, in coming up with some questions before that we wanted to test. We had this idea that we wanted to evaluate certain kinds of ideas. We thought about evaluators that were originating inside this organization. We had people who had proposals and came up with these ideas to begin with. And essentially the thing that we were interested in was what happens when you blind people to the identity of a proposer. So are people going to give systematically different kinds of evaluations when you blind people from the identity of the proposer? So there are these other kinds of experiments that have been done, as you know, on blinding in other kinds of contexts, sort of suggesting that potentially minorities, outgroups, and can get slightly higher evaluations when you blind people for the identity. So the question that we were interested in was, how does blind evaluation affect the evaluation behavior and the outcome? Pretty simple idea. We wanted to do this in a real organization where there were high stakes in this particular case. We did the right things. We did a pre-analysis plan with the American Economics Association. I know there are other cases that are more kosher when you do management research, but one of my co-authors is more of an econ side. Very elaborate, 15 pages, single space, pretty much elaborating everything that we were going to do, all the different kinds of analysis, and outlining this is the thing that we want to do and how we're going to test it. So all the hypotheses and analysis were specified to essentially avoid p-hacking in this particular case. For those who are interested, I would probably not do it with AEA again. I think as predicted and other things probably do as well as this particular one. We managed in this particular case with the help of a partial insider to get access to a very interesting organization. So this is a large multinational company in the telecommunications sector with about 100,000 employees on all 5 continents, super active in research and development. So they have about 25,000 people. And over the last decades, they've accumulated about 50,000 patents. So a large organization, different kinds of R&D facilities spread around the world. And one of the things that they do is that they have this bottom-up generation of ideas from employees to detect new products and services. So the idea is obviously from the perspective of the organization is to get people that are in different corners of the world to come up with ideas. And one of the concerns that this particular organization had was that, are we giving systematically lower evaluations to women and to people outside the headquarters? And if that's the case, can we think about certain kinds of interventions to figure this out? So in this particular project, we evaluate real high-stake business ideas with real managers in this particular case, so innovation managers inside this particular organization. And the stakes from the proposer standpoint is that if they are selected at the very early stage when they had one of these ideas that they generated, is that they get resources and time to take this to the next step so that they can actually bring it all the way through the innovation funnel to ultimately go to the market. I'm not going to go through all the experimental design, but this is very sort of stylistic graph to get the message across. We have innovation managers who evaluate the ideas. They evaluate recent ideas that we selected out that no one has done in the past. They are being evaluated in a non-blind evaluation and in a condition of blind evaluation where they don't see the identity of the person who actually came up with the idea, the so-called proposer, and only get to see the idea. I'm not going to go over the results. We were pretty certain to, first of all, find, look, there are going to be biases. We were certain that women were going to get systematically lower scores and that people from outside the R&D main facility, the headquarters in this particular case, were going to get systematically lower scores, and that blinding could potentially overcome this particular difference. What did we find in this particular case? Maybe not so much. Just to show you one example how it's implemented in this particular case, this is a name that I replaced, an identity of the person. If you get to evaluate the ID in the condition of seeing the identity of the person, you see the name and where they're located, and then obviously an elaboration on the ID. In the blind condition on the right-hand side, you have exactly the same idea, but you don't have any information about the person that came up with. So again, we were certain to find these biases. We managed to get access, super excited to work on this project. It was one of the best times when it went live, even better when you had the results, and one of the worst times when we actually analyzed the results. So what we found is that pretty much as the Seinfeld quote goes, that this show was about absolutely nothing. We found very, very small differences, if any at all, and blinding had absolutely zero effect on the evaluation behavior. Is this something that went wrong? The good thing is that we got access, but then we're starting to think about, is it something that we did wrong? And what can we learn from this particular kind of experience? Then we tinkered around with different kinds of dependent variables. Is it different when you evaluate other things? Is it different when you start to consider like the amount of attention and time spent in this particular case? We didn't really find any differences. Is it the case that it's underpowered? So that's something that one could potentially see. We could obviously calculate the minimum detectable effect size in this particular case, but it could be, right, that even if the effect size is economically very small, that potentially the bias may be there. So if we blow up the sample size, we could detect very small and minuscule differences. And we could not do this. We could not go back in time. So we did a new online experiment to evaluate these ideas with a much, much bigger sample. We tried to rule out the ID quality that I think we did, but obviously there are limits to the extent at which you can do this. And again, we had to complement this with an online experiment. We looked at distributional effect, found no differences whatsoever. And again, some things that came up in the review process that I think they correctly pointed out is that there are differences between the within and between design. And we did this again with a new online experiment. So again, obviously, when you work with an organization, you manage to get access, you manage to convince the managers to give away data, potentially even do a field experiment. it's very difficult to go back and blow up the sample to get a larger access and the like, oftentimes because the organization is actually not bigger that would allow that to happen as well. So we could not, in this particular case, obviously invent a time machine. We tried to invent this, didn't work out. So we did an online experiment to actually rule out the alternative explanations. And I think this sort of illustrates one of the first things that when you work inside quantitative management research, one of the challenges is obvious, of course, even more so than what Gabriel actually spoke about, is that when you do interviews, that's not nice when you can identify the person on the other side. Sometimes the kinds of data that I'm interested in is also something that could potentially be incredibly dangerous for the organization if it would be in the hands of others. So when you sign a non-disclosure agreement, you get the data. Oftentimes you are not allowed to say the identity of the firm on the other side. And obviously, in the review process that many of management journals are now asking for, we cannot give away the data from this particular kinds of projects. So in management science, it's getting, for example, increasingly common, but in this particular case, we're just technically not allowed to do so. So obviously, how we did this in this particular thing is that we gave away all the data and the code from the online experiments that is open for anyone to essentially analyze again. So in one sense, this is like a failed experiment. I think it's an interesting null finding that we turn into an advantage in this particular case. But I think it's also to the earlier presentations sort of gets to this point that it's very, very difficult to get access. And I think potentially even more so when you work with quantitative data. So many of these collaborations fail. They fail in the process of getting access. It looks promising in the beginning, but essentially you have to kiss many frogs to find something that is a good match so that someone on the other side is actually willing to give you the data, to work with you over an extended period of time to turn this into something that would become interesting for you as a researcher. I think there are tons of obstacles to make this happen. One of my dear office neighbors came in to me recently, said that now we had access to a really interesting organization that could potentially be like a really, really interesting experiment. And we discussed this, like what would it require on our end to get data? What would we need to be interesting for us to publish it in the best journals? And what could we provide from the partner to actually make it meaningful for them as well? I think oftentimes this kind of projects is something as a PhD student is actually very difficult to do because it's a very long process, hard to get access. Maybe you don't yet have the stature in the community unless you ever so lucky to piggyback on the pre-existing connections that you have. On the other hand, I think it's super important to actually escape the ivory tower and go out there, understand how organizations work. And I think business schools are often accused of being like increasingly distant from practice. And honestly, sometimes when I go to conferences, I tend to agree that many people talk about things that are incredibly remote about how organizations actually work. That's one of the aspects that I appreciate with qualitative research. I obviously have very detailed descriptions and thick descriptions about how organizations work. And I think one of the nice things about working with this with quantitative data is also that you can start moving slightly closer to practice without selling yourself out. So obviously, qualitative data, as has been already elaborated, details context, helps you understand different kinds of processes, illuminates new kinds of variables. And I think the point about quantitative management research that you do inside an organization can be a super useful complement to figuring out like causality, doing things that is it just the story of one, even if you do multiple interviews, there are certain kinds of things where you nicely can complement qualitative research with quantitative research. I think there are lots of examples of people who have done this in the past, but it's also very actively done in economics under the rubric of insider econometrics, where you partner up with different kinds of organizations, get access to very rich data. And I think in their part is oftentimes done on employee productivity and consumers, which is oftentimes under the label of insider econometrics. So one of the crazy pandemic projects that we're starting to work with Henning and Eamon is starting to interview some of these people and scholars who've actually published in the top journals on more on the macro side of working with these kinds of projects. So getting access to quantitative data with in collaboration with a company and some of the problems that actually occurred in the process. We were very curious about this because we struggled with it ourselves to learn from the experiences that other people had about both the positive and the negative experiences of the collaboration, and hopefully come up with, in the end, when we're done with this project, with some recommendations for how to structure this more efficiently as well. I'm just going to go through it very briefly. I'm happy to share some of the working papers and work in progress that we have. It's very much work in progress. It's like a construction site, like Berlin is always. And we talk about 4 different kinds of phases that, again, actually connects very nicely to the previous presentation. So about initiating, conducting, but also in terms of publishing and assessing the impact, because there are a number of implications about this and how you can actually publish it and some of the issues that exist. So let me go through them quickly in turn. So when it comes to like initiating, there are multiple kinds of motivations for why you should do this kind of research, and also some of the challenges that exist. So obviously, one of the nice things about this is that many journals now, I think, are putting a premium on having some kind of unique and compelling data. And if you are like me, a person that is relatively slow, there are other people out there that are much quicker than I am. This can become like a natural barrier to entry. So I would very, very rarely work on something that can just be scraped online or using existing data sources, because I know that there are other people that are going to be much, much quicker than myself in getting this published. And it's obviously partly driven by my own curiosity, the kinds of questions that I'm interested in, but I think it really nicely sort of mimics the kind of way that I want to do research. I'd rather work on a project for a few years and a big project than getting like a number of smaller projects out of it. And obviously, when you work on publicly available data, there could be people that are just much quicker than yourself that beats you to publication. Another implication that many people are sort of emphasizing is obviously like the need to understand real organizations. One thing that you can see from the people that we interviewed, and it's not purposely sampled, right? We try to get people who actually done this kind of research. Oftentimes they're more senior, past tenure, trying to understand real organizations, trying to give back something to more practice-oriented research as well. Obviously, like the biggest impact for why you should do this to begin with is new questions, to understand things that would be very difficult to do with a larger cross sample or using archival data. I think it can be super meaningful as well to actually understand how organizations work. Sometimes they're not as clean and easy to understand as you think, that there are issues with the data itself, but it can be like a really meaningful experience in terms of actually understanding how organizations work. And again, this idea of like rubbing shoulders to understand practice, I think sometimes we dismiss this as like a practitioner piece or something that, oh, it just deals with something closer practice. But I think sometimes we just like way too distant from what managers actually work with, which actually does not preclude our that we can do good research that can be published in the best journals. That said, I think there are tons of challenges to both start and sustain these collaborations. Oftentimes you hinge upon personal connections. It could be the case, as was mentioned previously, that some of these people leave the organization, leading to all kinds of issues. I know horror stories of people that worked on Access for a few years, only to have access revoked after this particular key person left, who was no longer interested in the project. They signed a contract to get access, and all of a sudden, after working on this, they could actually not publish this particular kind of research. Oftentimes, approval also involves many different kinds of touch points. So you would like to get data from the IT department or the HR records, or maybe you need approval even from the very top of the board. In many countries, you also need approval from unions and the like. That may actually slow down the process and make it a very lengthy thing to get this particular access. There are lots of these meetings that essentially go nowhere. I know this from experience, that you start with many different kinds of projects. You have a really cool thing that you want to work on. You use your connections, but many of them actually lead absolutely nowhere, which obviously make it maybe not the most productive way of doing research, but I would argue still quite meaningful. Another thing that I think can be a challenge to sustain these collaborations is that when you start to crunch the numbers, like the N that exists inside the organization actually becomes much smaller than you think. So if you're interested in employee productivity or something like this, it has been the challenge of obviously getting like a large enough organizations where if you want to do an experiment where you can actually do this. I am more positive now than I was a couple of years back. Now there are a number of papers coming out with super small n, where people have been incredibly detailed in showing what the treatment arms are like, and that I think are like beautifully done, that work with very small numbers as well. Another issue that I think exists here is that if you work at an elite school in your own country, obviously it opens doors to a much larger extent than if you work in a more peripheral school, which obviously to some extent can create inequality in the profession, not only resources, but also in terms of getting access to organizations. So obviously, if you work at elite schools, you're going to have more possibilities to meet people in the top of organizations that you in turn can ask for certain kinds of favors. Ethics approval was mentioned earlier. I think the additional thing in this particular case, if you work on these kinds of projects, is also privacy. So oftentimes you have to scramble the information, and the bigger challenge is that oftentimes you have to combine it with multiple kinds of data sources inside an organization that may not have been previously combined, that creates additional kinds of challenges of how this is done. There are examples of researchers even putting a server inside the company to make sure that those kinds of combinations are being run inside the organization, scrambled, and then provided to the researchers on the outside. There are also lots of different kinds of challenges that points in this direction. Like obviously this kind of data is not created for you guys. It's created for the organization itself. They don't care as much as we do about code books, understanding like the structure, because sometimes they are more disconnected, as I mentioned before. Sometimes many organizations, they say that they store historical information, but there's like a huge success bias. They throw out stuff that they are no longer interested in, which means that you actually created like a challenge for yourself if you don't keep an eye on this early on. Oftentimes, even if you manage to get access, this particular kind of data access oftentimes means that you have to convince people at multiple levels. So like you get the sign off of someone on the top, but you may have someone who's actually trying to stop you in the IT department to give you access to the data that you actually need. Anonymizing data can be a very, very big issue. I mentioned this example of putting a server inside an organization. I think it's really like an interesting example of how this particular problem can be solved. And I think oftentimes like the raw data of one database that they have is usually not enough. So combining different kinds of data sources can be a challenge, and actually scramble the information so it becomes public, so it becomes available to you. One obvious challenge is that, look, academics, to be fair, are not necessarily famous for being fast and getting things to become published. There were examples before about like the contribution is not big enough. We heard this before. And it takes years to publish stuff. And companies are impatient. They would like to see some kind of output in return. The way that I think is oftentimes being solved is to provide some smaller deliverables along the timeline. So a glossy PowerPoint of some kind, potentially even like a practitioner outlet, where you give something on the way to get to the journal article that you actually had in mind to begin with. There are obviously lots of different kinds of challenges as well, and I'm not going to downplay those kinds of challenges. I have some colleagues that think like, why on earth do you actually engage on this at all? It has lots of issues around generalizability. Can you learn from an organization that one? There are tons of things that I think you can actually do, and I think the field is moving closer to marketing in many ways, that now is becoming increasingly common to do it in collaboration. One collaboration inside an organization that you put a large premium that opens the door to different kinds of journals, because many editors actually like this kind of stuff, and then combine it with something else on top, as the example that I had in the beginning as well. Obviously, it hinges upon like a good theory for why you do these things to begin with, but there are various different kinds of ways that you can actually overcome this. The hard thing here is this idea of like open science and sharing data. I would love to share the data. I can share the code for many of these kinds of projects, but the pressure to release data becomes very difficult when you do this kind of research. And in some journals I think most journals now are having different ways to overcome this particular kind of challenge, but it is a challenge. And I think we have to, as a field, think much carefully about how we're actually going to solve this issue. Many people point out this, like, look, you actually get a bonus for having novelty in the data, of not just using like one of these existing archival data sources, to come up with a new kind of organization that provides a new lens for understanding an issue from a new kind of perspective. I think about this as obviously not being big data, but being a bit like thick data in the sense of actually understanding like the details and inner workings of an organization. And I think it can very nicely complement some of the qualitative research that many people are doing out there as well. The issue with this is that I think, given that it's hard to get access, it's hard to convince organizations to give away the data, to collaborate with them, find a mutual ground, signing the contracts, getting the data published. Oftentimes, if you work in a school that has a tendency to do bean counting in a sense of, sure, you've done like a number of different top journal publications, and now you sort of are in the process of getting tenure, maybe this is not the kind of strategy that actually works, because I think it's actually kind of high impact, can be high impact research if you do it well, because you're hopefully going to get access to no one else actually does. But it's very difficult to be as productive as some other people that do more archival kind of research. Hopefully, right, you can get higher impact research by the result of doing something that hopefully no one else has done in the past. I use it, and many other people do this as well, as a mechanism of finding new partners from the old. The nice thing about this is that oftentimes when you have something published, you potentially even created like a practitioner piece based on it, it can be like a really good door opening for the second project. So I think many people also mentioned this, that look, it was incredibly difficult as a newly minted PhD student to do this kind of research. But once I've done one project, it opened other kinds of opportunities to collaborate with other kinds of organizations. I know that at many schools, people frown upon like these practitioner kinds of outlets, which I never fully understood why. I think it's also like our obligation to turn it into something that people can actually read. I think the joke that I have about my academic papers is that they have a readership of 3, like myself, my mom, and my dad. And then I think in my case, my mom would never read my academic papers, so they have a readership of 2. The cool thing about this kind of research is that doors are opening for practitioner kinds of outlets that you in turn can use to actually get access to other kinds of organizations as well. And I think it can also be a way to keep the relationship hot, in the sense that many of these people actually care about these outlets, and they wouldn't care about an organization science, ASQ, or AMJ kind of publication, which I never heard about, by the way. I think the risk about this and how you sort of assess the impact is that it takes a long time to usually do these kinds of projects, right? But it could also be that you study like a fruit fly, that it may be like a new phenomena that die in the process of doing the research, which is like a potential risk of doing these projects as well. I have much more that will elaborate on this particular kind of project. I'm happy to share a much longer version of the paper that is currently way too long, that gives you an outline of what other people said, the issues that they're facing, the good times they had, and the bad times, and the horror stories. And I'm happy to share something about the 4 phases, about initiating, conducting, publishing, and assessing impact. With that, I thank you for your attention and open up the floor for questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Linus, and sorry for mispronouncing your name earlier with the.
No, I used to live in the US. You can call me anything you like. Yeah, so Linus, that's fine.
You're too kind. Yeah, it was like a reminder of like the Charlie Brown character.
Exactly.
So any questions for Linus? Insider research. Okay, so Santana asked if the innovation ideas were real or if it was developed by the researcher.
So
organization's doing,
in the
yeah.
field experiment, they were obviously real, right? Like they were real business ideas from inside this particular organization. For the online experiment, it's a good question, actually, right? Because what happens there is that we're obviously not allowed to post the real business opportunities to the public to do the online experiment. So for the online experiment, we came up with ideas from rewriting things from a Kickstarter category. It's publicly available in a very long appendix. I can, to sort of Bethany's point, we had lots of struggle to get this paper published as well. We went through like multiple rounds. We started with a research note because we had a null finding. It became a full paper. Then it became like a research note again. And I think the online appendix now is much longer than the actual paper. So it's publicly available in the research note if you're interested in what we use for the online experiment. And also if you want to redo and check our analysis, the code and the data is publicly available for the online experiment.
All right, thank you. Any other questions for Linus? Okay, so great question. So Alberto has a generalizability question. How would you handle a generalizability concern from reviewers?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think it's very interesting. So some of my colleagues that I really appreciate almost the most don't fully understand, like, why do you do this kind of research? Because it's very difficult to generalize. And to some extent, I think they have a point, right? I think this particular thing, like what you could say about our field experiment that we did inside this organization that I began with is that, oh, maybe this is just like one organization, it would never sort of apply to other kinds of contexts. And that's also why we combine this with something else afterwards. I think the intervention for me is also like the methodological invention of what we do inside the organization is actually interesting because it's like a mechanism for other kinds of organization to figure out if this would be an issue inside their organization. I think, again, you can combine it with other kinds of things. There's one anonymous attendee. So we collected for the online experiment, we do two different kinds of things. And both of them actually coming from Prolific in that particular case. So we recruited 1,543 people from Prolific to run the online experiment. So I think to overcome some of these things, it's usually quite nice to do something else on top. I think the issue is if you only do things that are like Prolific experiments, I'm not always 100% sure. I mean, I know that people more on the micro side sometimes do this, but I think also in other kinds of disciplines, there's also like a push to do it for real organizations as well. So I think honestly, the best thing is to combine it so that you have a deep understanding of how an organization works. And also to Gabriel's point, like, I don't think I've ever done one of these projects in collaboration with a company where they give access to quantitative data without understanding the context, right? Like I always do interviews first to understand, like, smell the beast and trying to understand the organization, like what am I looking for? And then obviously you need to have like some contextual understanding, and that usually that's very useful for understanding, like, look, did I miss something? Is it something that is like strange in the data? And also can be very useful sources for like, if you get problem in the data collection itself. So can you ask someone else that you're starting to get, like, can you help me to get access to these particular kinds of things? So I would always try to combine it with something else as well, if you can. But I would strongly encourage people to do this research more. Now I sound like I want to do like a commercial for this kind of research, which is obviously not. I think there are tons of risks as well.
Yeah, thank you. So this is a good question probably for anybody on the panel. So someone asked about how you feel about collecting data from platforms such as Prolific. So probably more for micro researchers, but what are your thoughts on that?
I just responded. I think like in combination with something else, I think it's great. So I'm curious what the other people say.
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that.
We've used Prolific on a scale development project I'm working on, and it's amazing. It's just wonderful, and I love it so much. But But I think that that's a really good point about context and understanding more specifically what you're asking about. Like if it doesn't make sense for your research question, then maybe not. But I'm in love with Prolific. It has a lot of my money. I'm interested if other people have had bad experiences though, or whatever.
Yeah, and I think, my own view, I actually just used Prolific on a paper that's going through the review process right now. And we had a really good experience. It's not, so this is to Linus's point, I think it'd be really hard to publish a paper in a top journal just using Prolific. So it's nice as a series or a sequence of studies. In our particular paper, we have a field study, actually using archival data, is study 1. And then we have a Prolific study in study 2, where we're testing the mechanism and testing boundary conditions. So Prolific can be nice for that, but I think it's hard to get that into a top journal if that's all you have, because of some of the limitations of that data, right? It's going to be single source. You could have longitudinal data, but that massively increases the cost of, and so it's nice having it paired with something else. Yeah, good question. There was a question from Grace to you, Bethany. So she was asking about when working with archival data, what happens if essentially you can't find the exact information? I assume she means that the exact variables that you need for your research question. So how do you suggest managing that?
Yeah, maybe the first part is that managing your own expectations. It is, man, I've spent many hours down rabbit holes looking for the right data set that would answer questions that we're looking for. It's a hard one. This is why the work up front is where you really want to spend your time, putting that time into, is this the right data set? But I also liked what Eric had said earlier about this being what the questions we're asking, not the scales we're looking for. So we were, for example, a measure of socioeconomic equality, I said that wrong. Socioeconomic status, SES. We needed that as a control variable. And there's so many ways of calculating that. So when we were going in and looking for that as a control variable, we had to decide what time point or time points we needed it at, and then how to measure it. And so the point being, that's kind of a silly example because of the control, but like, I liked how Eric talked about, like, what's the question, job demands? Okay, then how are we looking at how that's measured? As opposed to, I want this measure of job demands as these items. And then, at this time point, sort of having some flexibility. But also just knowing that this is that upfront process and knowing what kind of journal you're okay publishing in. Like if you are, I only want a top tier journal, then that's going to kind of set your bar for how close the data needs to match. This specific items need to match what your question is. So I think there's a couple ways of thinking about it. It's hard. What this very unlikely, but possibility is there are some of these large scale collection that they actually ask for you to submit questions that you'd like to be asked in a future study. So there's a little bit of flexibility within some of those that you can put your own questions in. I've never tried it, but it looks cool. Sorry, I know it's not a good question. It takes a lot of time.
Yeah, I think I would add a couple of things, and thanks, Bethany. I would say if you're studying something, like if you're studying a construct that's really new, it's going to be a lot harder to get that from an archival data set. In the case where we're talking about, the constructs we're studying have been around for 50 years. So in that case, there's been a lot more scale validation. There's a much more kind of established conversation. If you're proposing a new construct, for example, I wouldn't go to an archival data set, right? So this is where the match between the method and the question is really important to think about. I would also think about ways when you're looking at an archival data set, how you can potentially create constructs and variables from items that weren't specifically designed to measure that. So as a good example is I would take a look at some of Tim Judge's work. So he's done a lot of work using archival data sets where he's used measures that they had measures that were intended to measure one thing, and then he grabbed items from different scales and was able to construct the construct he was interested in. So he's done some of that, for example, with course self-evaluations measures when he was first kind of starting that area a couple decades ago. So you can get creative with qualitative data, or I'm sorry, with archival data. Now, where you're going to get some pushback is if there is an established scale, a reviewer might ask, well, how does this, what's the validity of your scale compared to these other scales that we have? And then you may have to do some additional follow-up work to show that the scale you're using in your paper, that from this kind of amalgamation of different items and scales in an archival data set, is a valid way to measure that construct. So we have a question for Gabriel. So he asked about collecting qualitative data from online platforms. So have you ever done that? Any experience, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. Reading through your question, I'm not sure I'm actually the right person to answer this, because it's more taking qual data for a quant project. I use qualitative data for a qualitative methods paper. So I've never, I mean, I think you can definitely like look for archival material online. You can potentially ask participant on different platforms to answer certain questions. You cannot do a qualitative projects by doing that, by just collecting that type of data, because the most qualitative methods will ask iteration. So it will ask changes in the questions that you're asking, because you're analyzing as you're collecting the data. So if you're just sending a bunch of questions to people, you're expanding on a survey methods with qualitative data. That said, there might be some interesting things in archival research and in ways people develop analysis tools for big archival data sets for qualitative papers that might be interesting for you to look into. But if it's more for item generations, as you're saying, I think hopefully my colleagues can jump in and help me out. But I've never done that before for a qualitative project. Even though it is qualitative data, it's usually not going to be used in qualitative papers.
So we didn't do exactly that in a scale development paper, but we had asked a question, and based on people's answers to that open-ended question, we realized that we were missing a subscale for something we were generating. And so we went back in and developed some items sort of with the spirit of that. So they were talking about these experiences they'd had with a change in their life. And they were talking about these type of changes that we hadn't captured in the scale. And so we didn't take their words. It wasn't like an in vivo thing, but we went, oh, we're missing something, and then went back to the literature and looked at how other people talked about in the literature. And then from that, we were able to develop. So that's a little bit of it. The other thing I've been wondering is, I think that Qualtrics has a way to upload audio. Like, wouldn't that be cool if we have somebody just talk into their phone and then upload it, and then we could get it transcribed? But I've never figured that out. So if anyone does, I want to know.
So I do large scale analysis of content, of qualitative content for various different kinds of projects. And honestly, I just Google this on scale development, because I don't do much more like psychological scale development and stuff, but there are like a number of papers on this topic. And honestly, now is the time to do this kind of research as well. If you just have some knowledge about how to use existing APIs of automatically transcribing things and put it into different kinds of language models, this is something that can be done in like days. You just have to know how to use the APIs that are out there. So I always use, for example, I work much less by the desk these days than I did in the past. I just take notes at the gym on Otter, upload it, I have it afterwards when I come as text afterwards. And obviously there are APIs for this as well. So if you want to do this at a large scale with existing language models that are out there, now is the time to do so.
And I just wanted to point out, Bethany, that I use iMotion's online data collection platform to record video and audio of participants on Prolific and other platforms. So yeah, I've run hundreds of people through it. Yeah.
That's so cool. I don't even know what that is. Thank you.
Well, we can talk later, but I will say that, you know, having recorded a lot of video of prolific people, they are normal people, unlike MTurk. Nobody should ever use MTurk. Prolific is okay. Sorry, I know I'm not on the panel today. I just wanted to chime in real quick.
That's amazing. Thank you.
Thank you all. Any other questions that we can answer? think the answer to your question, Linus, is no. All right. I think that we can call it a day there. There's no other questions coming in. We've got about 5 minutes left. If any of the panelists have anything else they'd like to share, if not, we can call it there and Linus can get some sleep. All right, thanks everybody. We so appreciate your presentations and your engagement. Question about the recording. Yes, there will be access to the recording. So we have been recording here in the corner, and that'll be sent to everybody that was registered. Yeah, sorry, Hoda, you want to add something?
Yes, I just wanted to clarify because we do record this, but there is a delay between the time that we put, with this session and once it's uploaded on YouTube. I just wanted everyone to know it's usually like, I think Karma uploads it within a month or two. But once we do, I'll send an email to everyone to tell them that where they can actually find them. And you can actually go to Karma YouTube channel and saw all the previous consortiums that we had, both RMD and Karma, anything. Karma also puts all these resources out there as well, so you can check them out.
Thanks, Hoda. One follow-up question. We've had a couple folks ask about the slides. Is there a way to manage sending that out to folks?
Well, if you can just send me, the panelists, if you can just send me your slides, I can just distribute.
Okay. Thank you. All right, thanks everybody. Have a great rest of the week. And thanks so much for the great conversation and the wonderful questions. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Thank you.